Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Kristen Lindquist. She is a professor of psychology and neuroscience at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Her research seeks to understand the psychological and neural bases of emotions, moods, and feelings. And today we're going to talk about exactly that. We're going to talk about emotions and a little bit about their development across the lifespan, neuroscience, culture, and all of the different interesting aspects behind the psychology of emotions. So, Dr. Lindquist, welcome to the show. It's a big pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so since you try to tackle emotions from different angles and different perspectives, like, for example, neuroscience and psychology, and you also use different methodologies, tell us first, what are emotions, or basically, how do you approach them?
It's a good question. So part of the reason that I use multiple methods in my work is that emotions are these fascinating states that simultaneously have psychological features. So, things that we consider to be mental. They have features that are physiological, so ways that they impact our bodies. They are manifest in our behaviors. And of course, ultimately, they stem from activity in the brain. So they are deeply impacted by our social context and our cultures. And so over time, in order to really home in on what emotions are, I've had to incorporate all of those different methods that are taking into account all of those different psychological ingredients, if you will.
Great. So, getting into the development of emotions, or how children basically learn, or I mean, let's not use the word learn here, because
Sure, that's not.
that's already a bit tendentious, because there are people who come from a perspective where they think that emotions are sort of innate, hardwired, and we'll get into that conversation also. But I mean, there's this common idea that children come equipped with this ability to look at certain facial configurations and distinguish between different discrete emotion categories. So, what do you think about it? Do you think there's good evidence to support that?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose an answer to this question in some ways requires that we talk a little bit about the different theories that guide how people
Yeah.
think about emotion. As you alluded to, there has really historically, since antiquity, been this notion that the emotion categories that we talk about in daily life, be they anger or sadness or fear or joy, those are the terms that we use in English. Maybe you use different terms in Portuguese. Maybe you would, note different ones as being sort of the most important.
Yeah.
Um, but uh, there's a camp or a theoretical perspective that has sort of pervaded much of the literature, as well as sort of a counter perspective. But the perspective suggests that emotions are relatively inborn, either that, infants sort of even in utero are making these facial expressions, that their brains are really born with the mechanisms that are specific to those specific emotions. And that shortly after birth, they can perceive those emotions on the faces of others. Now, of course, there's another argument, another theoretical perspective that suggests that these emotion categories are largely shaped by the culture that infants are born into, and that maybe some basic developmental ingredients are present, but those are sort of molded like clay into the categories that are present in different cultures, or different groups of people. Now, if you look at the data is, well, it's rather messy, because many studies were not optimally designed to really adjudicate between these different hypotheses.
Okay.
Um, what is clear is that infants, in their very, very early moments, do pay attention to faces. So they seem to prefer faces and face-like shapes. So you can show them an oval with, two things up here and, one thing down here, and they will prefer that sort of configuration to other random configurations. And it's clear that infants over their early days and weeks begin to mimic facial expressions. They certainly pay attention to facial expressions. The question is, do they differentiate between, anger and sadness? Do they look at those two things and think, those are very clearly different? And there, the evidence is not clear that infants are really differentiating those categories. Early on, they're certainly not differentiating those categories. There's some evidence early on that made it look like they were, and those studies were confounded by the fact that certain facial expressions tend to have certain features. So infants will pay attention to, really white, shiny teeth, or really sort of white, wide eye sclera. And then the question is, over time, do they start to differentiate them as they move into 6 months, into 9 months, into a year? And it seems like differentiation does begin to emerge at that point in time. But what really remains outstanding is whether or not infants understand the psychological meaning of those faces, right? So they may be able to understand that a really stereotypical anger expression has different features than a stereotypical sad expression, but that doesn't mean that they necessarily know what to do with those facial expressions, right? What they might signal about their caregiver's internal state. Instead, there's some really compelling evidence that as children move into toddlerhood and preschooler years, that actually their ability to understand those facial expressions really tracks with their understanding of emotion categories in language, suggesting that in the absence of that emotion language, because they, have yet to hear caregivers frequently use that word, or they've maybe heard it, but they haven't internalized its meaning. Once they've internalized the meaning of, say, fear, they start to recognize that a fearful facial expression looks different than, say, a sad facial expression. So they understand the psychological meaning.
Mm-hmm. I mean, this is very interesting because I've had people on the show like cultural psychologists and also other psychologists who do work on emotions, like, for example, Batia Mesquite, Stephen Heine, and others. And I mean, I don't have a bet on this race, of course, personally, but it seems weird to me that how easily some people that come from a camp who favors more innate perspectives or biological perspectives so easily interpret the fact that infants perhaps are paying attention to different sorts of facial configurations and perhaps with different reactions to them as them really distinguishing between different emotion categories. Because, I mean, why is that the case? They could just be noticing a difference between two different, let's say, facial configurations, and that's it. I mean, they are not necessarily attributing different emotion categories to them. And not only that, but also sometimes when you are exposed to a similar facial configuration, but done or presented by someone who comes from another culture and perhaps in a particular context that does not correspond to the one you are used to seeing that facial configuration expressed on. I mean, for them it might make sense, but not for you. And so, I mean, you might interpret it as one kind of emotion, but for them, for the people who are part of that different culture, it's another kind of emotion, right? So, I mean, that this also works for adults, I guess, that we
Yes.
sometimes get things wrong, let's say.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean what you're touching on, which I have yet to mention, is even the validity of these posed facial configurations that people are showing infants in these studies, you know, their validity as a representation of a specific emotion category, right? So, the very caricatured anger expression with furrowed brows and, grit teeth and so on. Do people frequently make that facial expression when they're angry? Sometimes. There haven't been really great studies actually looking at sort of the frequency with which sort of ecological studies where you are examining the frequency with which people actually make those really stereotypical facial expressions. But as an observer of humans in the real world, I can assure you that many times when people are angry, they're making a completely different facial expression. So, the real task of infants and adults, for that matter, in the real world is to try and understand what a facial configuration means as people are experiencing it in real context, in the real world. And of course, that information is not only not highly caricatured and maybe quite variable across individuals and across cultures, but it's also not disembodied, right? It comes with lots of psychological context. It comes with lots of physical context. It comes with body movements. It comes with, overt behavior. And so what we've argued is that ultimately what infants are learning to do and children are learning to do, and some adults have mastered better than others, is figuring out what a particular behavior, be it on the face or on the body or what have you, means in a particular context. And they're using this conceptual knowledge that they've acquired through much experience about different emotion categories that someone could be experiencing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the other thing I was just about to comment on, but you mentioned it, and perhaps later on we also might get into embodied cognition a little bit, but it also seems a bit weird to me why there's this focus just on the face. I mean, because when you see someone, you don't see just their face, their isolated face, right? I mean, they are probably doing something with other parts of their body. They are behaving in particular ways. They perhaps say something, and all of that counts. And also the context they are doing it in, and all of that counts when it comes to how we interpret the emotions that that person is expressing, right?
Mhm. Yeah, I've thought about this and why the focus on the face.
Yeah.
I suspect that in some part it's just a glitch of history. I mean, surely humans are quite expressive with their faces, and
Yeah.
surely they use facial movements in communication. Um, but Darwin wrote about animal behaviors that he saw as homologous across non-human animals and humans. And Sylvan Tompkins, had a theory of emotion that really focused on the face. And from there, Paul Ekman and Cal Hazard, who
Mm-hmm.
were students of Tompkins, also perpetuated this model that had this strong focus on the face and attributed it back to Darwin. Now, in reality, Darwin did not believe that these homologous muscle movements necessarily had any function. He was just pointing out that, look, some animals, move facial muscles this way or move body muscles this way, and actually, it might be sort of a vestige of a behavior that used to be useful and is no longer. But linked Ekman and Tompkins and Hazard and so on really linked this idea back to Darwin. And as a result, the emphasis on the face as this evolved signal really, really took off. And again, part of that is probably a glitch of history that, people had this particularly sticky idea at a right point in time. And part of it is probably based in human experience that, we do very much focus on people's faces, you know, typically and neurotypically when we're communicating with folks. So for many people, it didn't seem strange, perhaps, that the face was so central. And yet, if you take a step back, as you've noticed, there's many other cues that people are using. There's a study that I quite like by Michael Krauss, where he manipulated what information people were using to try and understand other people's behaviors. And he separated the visual channel, so viewing people's faces, from the audio channel versus both. And what he actually found was that I believe that it was either that both was optimal, which is not that surprising, right? More information is better. But actually, audio was far superior for understanding what people were feeling. Because of course, you're getting their vocal prosody, but you're also getting the content of what they're saying, right? So in many ways, not surprising. But the face was not adding that much information, and in fact, as you can imagine, could actually be distracting.
Well, that's really fascinating, and perhaps it goes along, at least to some extent, with what I was saying, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That, people have idiosyncratic facial expressions. They might not map on to what you represent as a certain emotion category. And as you should suggest, I think that happens cross-culturally, when you're interacting with people who you are not used to seeing the facial behaviors of. So maybe cross-culturally is one extreme, but even just cross-group, right? When you are perceiving the facial expressions of your significant other, presumably you're an expert at that person's facial and body expressions and what they mean, relative to someone you've never interacted to, relative to somebody who's from a different subculture than you, relative to somebody who, lives halfway around the world and is from a very different culture.
No, you really notice this a lot when you get or when you interact or get in touch with people that come from cultures that are very distant. Like, for example, I am very interested in Japanese culture, and at the beginning, when I started watching videos of Japanese people talking and interacting, I mean, for me, it was a bit weird, some of their facial expressions and the way they positioned themselves in relation to the other person, and the fact that they didn't look in the eye of the other person as much as we do. But I mean, now I kind of get it a little bit better. So we have to adapt a little bit when we are exposed to people from other cultural contexts, right?
Yeah, I once found myself alone in a cafe in Japan. And I was sort of in the burbs, so not in a cultural center where maybe there's lots of different people of different races and ethnicities coming through. And it was one of the most sort of isolating experiences of my life because not a single person looked at me. I stood out like a sore thumb, this white Western woman sitting here in the middle of this cafe, and not a single person in the entire restaurant, even peeked over to look at me that I saw. Whereas, that would not happen in a Western context.
Yeah, but that sounds very Japanese.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so getting into another topic, talking about emotion concept. So what do we know about how children acquire them?
Yeah, we are learning much more actually in recent years about how children acquire them. And I think it's a process that is really very interesting. It happens in the context of social others. So it's ultimately social learning, or at least we think it's facilitated by social learning. So, would a child learn emotion concepts on their own, devoid of any sort of social feedback? I think we don't actually know, answers to that question. Aside from, these cases of, children who were highly abused, and kept out of social context for most of their childhood, who actually, seem to develop very atypical emotion expressions and behaviors. But a lot of it seems to be seeded by interactions with caregivers. So caregivers early on are interacting with their infants, face to face, parent and a newborn. There's a fair amount of facial mimicry that occurs in, neurotypical infants, where they will move their facial muscles in ways that caregivers move their facial muscles. Caregivers reinforce certain facial muscle movements, right? So that first time that your baby smiles at you, you're absolutely thrilled, in large part because it's been 6 weeks of total hell with an infant, and now they're finally giving you some social feedback. But what do? You give them a big smile, and you speak to them in tones that are very rewarding, right? So there's a lot of shaping early on the production side of things. But as children begin to acquire language, and we know that their receptive language is actually processing words long before they can produce words themselves. And so adults are regularly pairing certain situations with certain words. And this happens more and more as infants become mobile. So you get these developmental cascades whereby a child, suddenly can sit up. Well, the world looks very different once you can sit up. Once you can move, you can interact with things, right? You can try and take a toy. That has social consequences. And so as the interactions with caregivers change, perhaps the type of language that caregivers are using is changing. So early on, like, oh, are you happy? Are you sad? Are you sleepy? Are you hungry? But then as infants become able to interact with the social world around them, are you mad that, you can't get the toy out of the bin? And caregivers are using these labels that we hypothesize help to really sort of cohere together these otherwise really abstract categories, right? Emotions are abstract categories insofar as they have feelings, which are themselves, not entirely tangible. And as we said, they may map onto these perceptual features that you can see on other people or you can see in the world, but those are really highly variable. And so what we believe is happening is over time, infants are hearing this word in a certain context, and that's helping them essentially to like glue together those features such that they are building a category almost.
Mm-hmm. And they are learning perhaps not only the word that goes associated with particular feelings that they might experience in that moment or in that context, but also, I guess, I would imagine the appropriateness of the different emotions in different contexts, right? So, for example, perhaps in this context, it's appropriate for me to feel angry. In that context, it's appropriate for me to feel sad or to express also, not only feeling, but also expressing particular emotions, right?
Yeah, inherent in this process is that caregivers are teaching their children the culturally prescribed categories, right? So, if my culture has a category that is very relevant to, something about aggression and violation of norms, and maybe your culture would use a slightly different category. Well, my child is going to learn the category that I use, and a child in your culture will learn a different category. That even happens within cultures, right? So we have evidence that parents who use emotion words more in discourse with their children, so who are, ostensibly labeling emotion categories more, prospectively have children who are better able to understand emotions, they can better regulate their emotions, they can better see emotions in other people. And so, the more sort of discreteness, or what we call granularity, that I might use with my children, the more discreteness and granularity they see. Whereas if I was just saying, oh, you feel bad, then that child might not learn as readily how to differentiate different types of bad. And you can imagine that insofar as there's different types of bad that are adaptive in a culture, that child might be sort of missing that information, or, might be a little slower to gain that information.
And when, for example, there you mentioned that if parents speak to their children, particularly in these emotional terms, they perhaps develop better in terms of their emotionality, they have a better emotional development. You're talking particularly in a specific cultural context, right? It's not that generally speaking they're not as good as other people in terms of processing emotions, or is it?
So nobody to my knowledge has done the work where they say, if I use English emotion categories to talk to my children would then be better, going to Japan and understanding emotions there.
Yeah.
With children. Although there is evidence. So Josephine Delire-Snyder has really nice work focusing on how adults acculturate to other cultures in terms of their emotions. And what she's done is map over time how somebody who is living in another culture is acquiring an understanding of that culture's emotions.
Yeah.
And what she shows is that people's well-being ends up being better when they feel like they've learned the emotions of this other culture. And also that they feel more acculturated when they have learned the emotions of the other culture. That, part of coming to feel like you belong in a culture is feeling like your emotions match.
And probably some of that is due to how people react to you, right? I mean, because you really feel it when you're doing something that is not appropriate in terms of what the other people say, perhaps how they treat you, how in certain circumstances they might exclude you from that context and stuff like that, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. In my example of being in the cafe in Japan, I wouldn't have felt isolated if I had, sort of recognized that this was very culturally normative and it wasn't, a move of social exclusion. It was, I don't know, maybe respect or, who knows? And likewise, who knows what I was doing that maybe was quite strange. Maybe I was being very Western and looking around and, giving people big smiles and they thought, what is this woman doing? So emotions are necessarily dyadic, right? It's both about how I'm behaving and how you're in turn reacting to me, as well as how I'm perceiving your behavior.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of that concept that Batia Mesquita talks about in her book, that sort of ours perspective instead of mine perspective, because emotions are not just about what we feel on the inside, but are very much sort of a construct that occurs between me and the other people I'm interacting with, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's like a shared reality.
So, and people also talk a lot about affect in the psychology of emotion. So, what is the relationship between emotion and affect? And is there a difference there?
Yeah. Affect is a word that we use, as you say, in the psychology of emotion, and it's a word that I think causes a lot of confusion. So affect, in the way that I use it, describes sort of lower level features of emotion. So every emotional experience has some quality of valence. So whether it's pleasant or unpleasant, and activation or arousal, as we call it, which means that it's, sort of highly activated and awake, versus sort of lowly activated and sleepy or quiescent. And so we use the term affect to refer to those sort of basic features on which, all emotions can sort of be compared. Cabignac had a really nice description of affect as this sort of common currency for understanding the world around you, right? So you can compare two very disparate things in terms of them both being good or both being bad. And we believe that it's these basic features that derive from the nervous system and its function. And of course, infants are born with this affect. And it's this affect that gets shaped into these experiences of emotion. So affect can be about something in the world, right? It can be about delicious food or about a snake in your path that you would like to avoid. And over time, learning these culturally relevant categories helps to make that, desire or fear and so on. So affect is sort of the underlying substrate, we argue, for emotions.
Right. Something I haven't asked you about yet, at least directly, is emotional functioning. So, what is it and how does it develop?
Emotional functioning. I think emotional functioning is sort of or emotion processing is a catch-all phrase that you see people use. And I actually don't prefer it because
Okay.
it's so imprecise as to be, somewhat challenging. So I think it's most often used to say, is the system in order? Like, does someone have adaptive emotion processing versus maladaptive emotion processing? But what falls under that umbrella of processing could be very broad, right? Does it have to do with perceiving emotions in others? Does it have to do with expressing emotions? Does it have to do with experiencing and understanding your own emotions? Does it have to do with regulating your emotions? Does it have to do with emotion behavior? And so I guess that's my that's my problem with the term is I would rather people just say, how does emotion perception work, or how does emotion experience work, and so on.
Okay, so perhaps be trying to be more specific about what aspect of emotion you are referring to. Right.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I asked you about affect. One thing that we haven't talked about yet is affective experience and perception. So, because when we think about how these things develop, affective experience and perception, we tend to think about how they develop or focus on how they develop in children, infants, children, and so on, adolescents sometimes. But can they change across the lifespan? And by that I mean up till old age, adulthood, and into old age, and all of that.
Yeah, some of my research focuses on what happens in the latter half of the adult lifespan.
Yeah.
And Richie Davidson wrote this paper now many years ago, but described the sort of seven sins of affective science. And one, he argued, is that we assume that things are just stable across the lifespan, right? That, or actually, past early adulthood, that, you're developing until you hit early adulthood, and then you're just, a fully formed human and you're done.
Yeah, you get to 25 years of age, your cortex is fully developed, so nothing will change after that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Although the reality is, post 25, the cortically things start going downhill a little bit.
Yeah.
So, so yes, of course, there's a number of things that change across the adult lifespan that could impact emotion. And as a result, models that are looking at lifespan changes need to account for all of those things. So certainly there's lots of really nice evidence that the social context changes quite a lot as people age. Laura Carstensen, others have nice work showing that, people start to prune their social networks as they age. Young adults place a lot of value on having, broader social networks, and older adults, quite rightfully say, well, if somebody's not value added, then I'm gonna, not invest time in them anymore. Some of this has to do with a focus on time left. So they've extended these findings by looking at students in their first year of university versus their final university, and you can see an effect there where, in your early years of university, you are, trying to explore and expand your social networks. And in your final year, you want to exploit, the good friendships that you have and not necessarily sort of form new ones. So something similar appears to be happening in older age. Of course, as adults age, they also lose social connections due to illness or death. And so there's, sort of a external factor there as well. And researchers such as Laura Carstensen have argued that in part as a product of these sort of end horizon cognitions, people's motivations shift. They prefer to feel pleasant as opposed to unpleasant emotions, hence why, you get rid of Myrtle, who, always kind of annoyed you, and, it's not really worth spending your time with her because, she's not value added anymore. So clearly these sort of social cognitive processes occur. Older adults place more emphasis on emotion regulation. They at least believe that they are better emotion regulators, although Derek Izakowicz has done some nice work showing that in actuality, this probably isn't the case, that, their on-demand emotion regulation skills are equal, in some cases worse than younger adults, but they engage in different behaviors. So they will sort of avoid situations that don't bring them pleasure, and so on. Something that we've been showing in my work focuses on a slightly different angle. So instead of on the social context causing emotional changes, we're focused on how it is that an aging nervous system might actually be sort of preceding some of these changes. So this has been relatively less studied, but there's a fair amount of evidence suggesting that the peripheral nervous system is actually changing across the adult age span. So even starting around age 40, which is when you can start to see some changes in people's emotions, you start to get relative demyelination of the peripheral nervous system, some neuropathy, and that certainly extends into older life. And this is accompanied by what we know are structural and functional brain changes as well. And so we have a study that we're conducting now, where we're examining, how it is that the linkage between the brain and the peripheral nervous system might be sort of coming apart more over the adult age span, such that older adults are maybe having emotions that are less sort of viscerally activated, and as a result, maybe are experiencing their emotions as sort of less highly arousing, and less unpleasant and difficult to regulate.
So, if there's these differences between how the central nervous system connects to the peripheral nervous system, would that include interoceptive differences?
Yes. Yes, so there is some well-documented evidence that older adults do show decrements in interoception, which is the sensation and perception of changes in your viscera. So, the feelings that you get when your heart is racing and you're really nervous, or that you're breathing fast because you are excited, and so on. So older adults become worse than younger adults at identifying those changes. So for instance, in doing a task where you're asked to identify at rest when your heart is beating or not. It's a hard task, actually, for many individuals of young age, but older adults become even more inaccurate at being able to detect when, in fact, they're having a heartbeat. And we believe that this is part of that change in the brain as well as the peripheral nervous system. So it could be that changes to the sort of efferent connections to the peripheral nervous system, that is, brain to body signals, are changing, such that they are less intense and robust. As a result, you might perceive those signals to a lesser extent, or it could really be that both are changing.
So perhaps this would be a good point to introduce embodied cognition. I mean, you mentioned the connection between the central and the peripheral nervous system. Are there other perhaps parts of the body, or perhaps how people move, or how they use, or how they lose certain motor functions, perhaps that might also play a role in how they process emotions? I mean, not just focusing on the nervous system itself, but perhaps other aspects of their motility, I guess.
Yeah. So embodied cognition has sort of many forms, and over time has come to take on many meanings. So let me just be clear about how I use the term.
Okay.
So there, just like emotion, there's sort of been two camps in terms of how it is that cognition is represented by the brain, how concepts are represented. And one has argued that those concepts are relatively amodal, abstract, symbolic, so devoid of the sort of bodily modalities, right? Whereas, there's been arguments that concepts are actually constituted by sort of like rerunning those body-specific activations. So you know that something is an apple because you sort of simulate the taste and the smell and the crunch and the redness of an apple. So the latter work by folks like Larry Barcelo, I find very compelling. In my own work, I've incorporated that with newer predictive processing models of brain function, or active inference models, which suggest that, the brain is optimally using prediction to sort of use its knowledge of past experience based on the sensory information coming in to predict what will happen next. And implicit in that is that this is very adaptive for having actions that are well tuned to the context. So, imagine trying to catch a baseball without predicting where it's going to be, right? Your arm actually wouldn't be fast enough to catch the baseball if you waited until it was where it ends up. And so, your perception and action systems are using prediction, and that ends up being really important to emotion as well. So we hypothesize that, people are, based on the current sensory information they're experiencing, for certain contexts that they're in, they are predicting what actions their body needs to engage in next. And what this means is that concept knowledge is sort of seeding these visceral changes even before that next thing happens, right? So, we have all probably had an experience where, I live in North Carolina. There's snakes occasionally out and about. Don't like snakes. And so, I might be running down a path and I see something, laying vertically across the path, and I start to have a reaction because I'm going to, need to stop running. I'm going to need to jump out of the way. And then I realize it's a stick, right? So that's a prediction error that my brain has made. And yet I've already started to sort of activate the requisite behavioral actions. And so in that sense, I think that cognition is very much embodied, right? Cognition is ultimately for doing, and emotions probably ultimately evolved for doing as well.
Oh, come on, isn't cognition just occurring in the brain? I mean, what does the rest of the body matter here?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so and you talked a little bit or touched a little bit on emotional aging, or I mean the changes that occur in terms of emotion as people age. Are there things that occur in general, let's say to people in general as they age, certain ways that they perhaps process emotions that change in predictable ways for everyone or not?
Yeah, I don't know that we have enough of a handle on that yet. There is evidence that amongst healthy older adults, people until really their mid to late 70s start to experience actually more positive affect than younger folks, than people in their, let's say, mid 30s. So from sort of midlife on, you see this positivity effect on average in healthfully aging adults. It's also worth noting that due to the features of the samples that have been used in the past, those are generally, white, relatively middle class to affluent adults. And so I don't think we really know what those trajectories look like for everybody. We don't know what they look like in, disorders of aging, such as Alzheimer's and various dementias. Certainly, there's people who have geriatric depression who are not experiencing positivity effects. And we also don't know how individual differences function. There's some really fascinating work on folks cognitively who are called superagers. And in their case, their cognition looks very much like the cognition of younger adults. Their brains function like the brains of younger adults. And we don't yet know what the correlate would be for for emotions, right? Super aging emotions, I guess. Um, there's some argument that things like exercise may actually keep your brain and correspondingly your emotions more young. So still a lot of work to do there.
And I would imagine that some of it would also be culture specific.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So we've talked about culture quite a bit. What about gender? Are there specific ways in which men and women or other sort of gender identities might experience emotions differently?
Yeah, good question. Um, I, I'll start by saying, gender, of course, is different than sex differences,
Yeah.
which is also a question that people have. Um, so let's talk about gender differences first. It seems clear based on the literature that in Western contexts, men and women are socialized differently around emotion. So we spoke earlier about that finding that parents who speak to their children more about emotions have children who are more emotionally intelligent, right? They
Yeah.
understand emotions better in themselves and others, they regulate them better. What I didn't mention is that in those data, there's also effects that both women and men talk to girls more about emotions than they do to boys. And so, presumably implicit in our gender stereotypes are that, little girls care about emotions or need to know about emotions, such that both moms and dads talk about emotions more with girls than they do with sons, with the result being perhaps that, girls end up having richer emotion knowledge than the average boy. Of course, that's not the case across the board, but there's talk about toxic masculinity and boys don't cry, etc. And you can see that pretty early on in these studies.
So here the hypothesis would be that the reason why both fathers and mothers talk more about emotions to their daughters and not their sons is a product of culture as well. Right.
That's my hypothesis. And people say things anecdotally like, um, well, girls are just so different. They have stronger feelings, and so I think people perceive in the input that there's these differences, and yet it's really hard to know how the sort of top-down influence of these gender stereotypes is playing a role. There's some evidence that children as early as 3 years old, if you show 3-year-old girls and boys a picture of a crying baby that looks, completely androgynous, no cues to gender. If you label it a boy, both boys and girls will say that it's angry, and if you label it a girl, both boys and girls will say that it's sad. So you see this sort of gendered bifurcation, even in 3-year-olds, in which emotions are prescribed by, and this is a study from the U.S. So a Western industrialized culture.
And by 3 years of age, I would imagine that children have already received enough socialization to for this to be a product of that and not necessarily something that is, to use the word that many times people use, innate, right?
Yeah, I mean, by 3 years of age, you start to see lots of different stereotypes emerging in children, because their brain's whole job, from birth to early toddlerhood, is to just take in information from the culture. So you start to see racial stereotypes, for instance, other stereotypes that you would argue are not innate. And so it does seem like children are taking in the sort of culturally prescribed emotion stereotypes by that point in time.
Great. So let's get now into the link between morality and emotions. This is something that really interests me, and nowadays, I mean, one of the most prevalent views out there is the one linked to moral foundations theory, where Jonathan Haidt and others have been trying, at least to some extent, to link between to establish links between particular moral foundations or specific moral values and discrete emotions. So what is your take on that? Do you think that that's a particularly good approach to understanding the relationship between morality and emotion?
Yeah, moral foundations theory is a typology of moral behavior, just as basic emotion theory is a typology of emotions. And my opinion, based on the data, is that both have taken, somewhat common sense notions and have sort of formalized them as psychological categories that can be perceived in the world around us. And so, perhaps as a product of that, it's compelling to think that, anger is an emotion category that is triggered when a certain moral foundation is triggered, right? That breaches of authority might trigger anger, whereas, breaches of purity might trigger disgust and so on. Having reviewed that literature, there's not a lot of clear evidence for those assertions, in large part because the studies haven't been designed in a way that rules out things like affect. So studies haven't been designed to rule out that it's, mere unpleasantness that is causing certain moral perceptions, or that moral perceptions don't cause just general unpleasantness, not being able to rule out anger versus disgust. In other cases, studies have sort of conflated the sort of conceptual area that they're examining. So, conflating things like notions of contamination and experiences of disgust, which involve contamination, right? So the literature, I think, as of now, doesn't very clearly argue for these one-to-one mappings. Again, this is not to say that affect isn't related to morality. I think very much affect is related to morality. In my take, morality is something that evolved because it helps us to navigate our social world, and affect is very much at the heart of navigating our social world. So too our emotions, but very likely. Those are the features that are sort of at the core, and everything else is culturally constructed around that.
So tell us then about what would be an alternative view to the link between morality and emotions, like, for example, a constructionist perspective on that issue.
Yeah, I mean, a constructionist perspective on that issue is somewhat akin to what I just articulated, that, there are some basic cognitive and perceptual abilities, and that people then sort of construct meaning around those that are culturally relative. So, for instance, Kurt Gray and others have argued that, what really lies at the heart of moral concern is perceptions of harm. So, is a person harmed, right? Something like murder is the canonical example of a moral act where, I kill someone else, I have harmed that person, clearly immoral, right? But there's other examples that are a bit fuzzier. And what he's nonetheless shown is that people still perceive harm to underlie those instances. So if you think that burning a flag is immoral, then you perceive that that act is sort of harming the sanctity of your country, or harming veterans, or harming your forefathers. If you believe that abortion is immoral, it's because you are harming a life. If you believe that abortion is moral, it's because you are, not harming something that is already a existing human, right? And so he's demonstrated that cognitively, and I would say effectively, right? Because harm, I think when we simulate harm, it is embodied, right? That we are, causing damage to something, and that has a negative affective tone to it. So he's shown that people, that these perceptions are sort of underlain by this cognitive template, I would say affective template, cognitive affective template.
And I guess this is also sort of associated with the approach Hyde takes in moral foundations theory. What do you make of modular approaches to the mind?
Yeah, I think that modular approaches to the mind are ultimately untenable in the sense that brains largely did not evolve to have modules. And let me, I will give some caveats there. So,
Okay.
Brains evolved to be maximally efficient because having a brain is actually metabolically something that is quite costly for a body. And especially having the types of brains that humans have is incredibly metabolically costly. And organizationally, it doesn't make sense that brains would have evolved to have, one area that does some social function, one area that does another social function. Do brains have areas that represent preferentially vision? Sure. Although actually there's a lot more multimodal representation, even in visual cortex, than we would typically assume. And so, the notion that brains have these specific mechanisms that map on to these psychological constructs is largely untenable based on how brain evolution works.
So I want to ask you a question that I bet many people are dying to hear the answer to. But there's this common idea that some people are emotionally more complex than others. Is there any evidence, scientific evidence to support that?
Yeah, this is an area that I've done a fair amount of research in and that I'm quite interested in. The short answer is yes. So, if people are ultimately acquiring conceptual knowledge that helps them to parse up affective space over time, then you could imagine that there's a lot of individual differences in what that looks like. As a product of one's socialization, as a product of one's environment, perhaps as a product of one's conceptual abilities, right? Maybe some people are just really good learners and really good at sort of updating their cache of knowledge because of their brain structure and function, or because they care about that domain, right? I mean, there's some people who just are not particularly interested in emotions, and we can come back to like gender socialization there. So yes, there's a lot of clear evidence that there are people who differ in how discreetly they experience their emotions. So people who go through daily life and can report to you that, in this instance, I was angry. In this instance, I was sad and a little bit anxious. In this instance, I was just sad. In this instance, I was disgusted and a little bit angry. And there's other people who will report, in instance one, I was sad, angry, and disgusted. In instance two, I was sad, angry, and disgusted. In instance three, I was sad, angry, and disgusted. And what people are communicating in that latter instance, we believe, is that they're just experiencing all the things, and they don't meaningfully differentiate between those negative emotions, suggesting that they may just feel a lot of undifferentiated negative emotion. And that seems to relate to a number of different phenomena we and others have shown. So people who are more discrete or more granular, that is, they can sort of parse up their emotions better, end up being better at regulating their emotions. They can better perceive emotions in other individuals. During acute stress, actually have profiles that look a little bit more typical of sort of having adaptive responses, and they report fewer unpleasant emotions. And they also tend to have physiological responses that are more differentiated across those contexts. And so there is evidence that, people differ in this way. The question is, how do you become someone who is more emotionally complex versus less, ultimately?
And that's where we're not sure if it's perhaps more of a biological thing or something that it's easier for people to learn if they want.
I am a firm believer that people can learn it if they want.
Yeah.
There is evidence that, for instance, psychotherapy works. Different types of psychotherapy are more evidence-based than others, but the ones that have been shown to be effective are essentially teaching people to rethink their emotional reactions to the world. And so I think that people absolutely can learn. I think the developmental evidence suggests that people do learn, right? So the evidence, again, coming back to the notion that, if you have caregivers who are, essentially indirectly teaching you these emotional terms, then you end up better understanding those emotional terms.
Yeah.
There's some nice work coming out of the Yale Emotional Intelligence Center, also showing that these more explicit trainings in socio-emotional learning for children are also effective. So children who've had emotion learning in classrooms versus not end up having better academic outcomes, are better emotion regulators, and so on. So it's definitely learnable. Questions about who might have an easier versus a harder time learning that, I think, are interesting and something that we just don't know a lot about. Certainly, if you have a physiological system that produces really, really strong emotions, then, it may be harder to differentiate between your emotions. You might have more of an uphill battle to understanding those emotions. But, there's evidence that once you understand those emotions, in turn, it can sort of reduce that physiological activation.
Great. So I want to ask you now a couple of questions about basic emotions, and then also a final question that will not be emotion related, but more of some of the work you've done on social justice issues also, because I think it is very important and very relevant to talk about it in the present socio-political environment, I guess. So there's this idea when it comes to emotions that cross-culturally people universally essentialize emotions. They think about emotions as essences. Is that true? Is there evidence to support that?
That people universally think about emotions as essences, having essences.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know that we have the data to suggest that people across cultures think about emotion categories as having essences. And in fact, I would venture to guess that certain cultures, in fact, don't think about emotions as these essentialist categories that are sort of grounded in nature and have clear and identifiable features. Um, it seems clear that even within a culture, people sort of differ in terms of that particular assumption. Some people seem to have cognition that is more essentialist, sort of imbuing these deep, often biological roots to the categories that they see. Other people seem to see them as emerging from, more general sort of situated properties. And you can sort of see this play out even in different theories of emotion, right?
Right. So, throughout the interview, we've been talking about the psychology and neuroscience of emotion and how also a little bit how the brain processes emotion. So, with all of that in mind, do you think it makes sense to talk about basic emotions from a psycho-neuroscientific perspective, let's say?
Um, I'm gonna rephrase that a little bit and
Okay.
say, you know, I think the question on everybody's mind who studies emotion is where do they come from and how are they similar versus different across people
Okay.
around the and people have come to relatively different answers on that. Um, you know, to my mind, I think people in many contexts around the world experience emotions that they might translate into the English word anger. And then the question is, where did that category come from? What function does it serve? And how is it similar versus different in people around the world? And so my particular approach to that has been to try and understand what neurobiologically might be similar in people around the world,
Yeah.
and what culturally might be both similar and different. And I've recently taken this cultural evolution approach where we hypothesize that you know many humans have the same ultimate hardware, right? And there may be similarities across cultures in terms of the types of social situations that humans find themselves in. But beyond that, individual cultures have drawn different meaning potentially around those social situations. So social situations like you know, property ownership may exist in many cultures, but not all, or violations of norms of the society exist in many human societies. Um, and, those are the sorts of themes around which people may have constructed emotion categories such as anger. And they might have different flavors in different social groups. And those particular meanings are passed on to one's children. When people interact with members from other cultures, they may adopt certain features that are relevant to their culture. And so you can get this sort of evolution and drift without that being biologically instantiated per se.
So that's where we get into a cultural evolutionary perspective of emotions, right? Because I mean, it's not that perspective is not denying at all that there might be some biological slash evolutionary aspects to emotion processing, and all of that. There certainly are some, I guess, but I mean, they are I think we could say culturally instantiated, right?
Yes, yeah, exactly. So, I don't believe that there's evidence that a, anger circuit evolved in the brain of mammals. Are there behaviors that evolved that we associate with the category anger? Absolutely. Do mammalian species have a conserved circuit for different types of aggression, defensive aggression, offensive aggression, and so on? Sure. But that is not clear evidence that an anger circuit per se evolved, right? Because that particular circuit is not active every single time somebody has an experience of anger. And so, it may be that we have constructed culturally relevant meaning around some of the biological scaffolding, and then that meaning is what has evolved over time as human culture has evolved.
And also because it's not because people have the same brain architecture, or at least the same basic brain architecture, and because we might find people across different cultures, if we do fMRI scans, for example, more or less the same brain areas lighting up if they are put in this or that context. I mean, I don't imagine that would happen, because it would be really weird that people the exact same areas of the brain would light up in people from different cultural backgrounds. But anyway, even if that happened, it's not necessarily the case that people are experiencing the exact same emotions, because I mean, the same areas of the brain, even if connected exactly the same way, do not necessarily inter-individually correspond to the exact same emotional phenomena or even behavioral expressions and all of that, right?
Yeah, so, even within members of a culture, there is tremendous variation in
Yeah.
which brain regions are active when somebody is having a particular emotion.
Yeah.
And as you say, that corresponds to the situated nature of the emotion, differences in people's behavioral adaptations to that situation, and so on. So there's no like core essence that makes something an emotion category in terms of brain activation. The notion that the amygdala lights up, and that's the fear center, and everything else is sort of window dressing, I believe is no longer sustainable. You can do these sort of decoding type analyses with brain function and say which brain regions are sort of uniquely predictive of one category or another. And the brain regions that tend to be uniquely predictive are areas in this, very heteromodal, cortex that is involved in things like semantics and autobiographical memory and representing abstraction and representing predictions. And so to say that that's where discrete emotion categories live seems quite at odds with the notion that, these are evolved mammalian behaviors that, exist in some ancient cortex or subcortex.
Yeah, I might be wrong here, and please correct me if I'm wrong. But also, I guess that from what we know today, I mean, talking about, for example, the amygdala as being the fear center, I mean, that's probably meaningless, right? Because, I mean, there's not really a particular area or region of the brain that is the fear center or the anger center. I mean, we're talking nowadays about networks, right?
Mhm.
It's not that there's one single isolated area of the brain where fear is processed or whatever kind of emotion, correct?
Yes, I think that we have moved beyond the fear center idea. Although, in the not too distant past, it was pretty prevalent, and to some extent was a product of the methods that we had access to, right? And our sort of conceptual models of what emotions are. Um, yes, now we've sort of moved to a network-based approach of understanding how the brain functions, right? No region of the brain is an island that operates in the absence of other brain regions. And so the dial has sort of shifted to saying, well, like, what is the network that creates fear? Well, the reality is there's many networks, right? And it really depends on the situation and the sort of situational affordances. Because again, emotions are for doing. And so, a situation where you are fearful because you're, about to fall over a cliff versus you're afraid of giving a speech in front of your most highly esteemed colleagues versus you're afraid of a snake on the path. Like those all
Yeah.
have very different behavioral correlates, and as a product, all have very different neurophysiological correlates.
Yeah. Okay, so let's then address the final topic for our conversation today, social justice issue. So you're also interested in this topic, and particularly when it comes to representation and career advancement in the sciences, particularly for women. So, okay, so I've already talked about this several times on the show, and there are some people that, when it comes to interpreting these results, the fact that perhaps women are not as represented, at least in certain scientific areas, and it's harder for them to advance in their careers. They try to reduce everything or the entire question to biological sex differences. And so men and women have evolved in different ways, and so men have these particular kind of interests, women have that particular kind of interests, and so on. So that sort of argument. I would like to ask you, what do you think about it, about that kind of argument, and uh, what do you make about this issue? I mean, what would be perhaps an alternative explanation for why, in certain specific scientific and academic areas, even in general, we don't see as women represented as much as men, for example?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, in some ways, the same tensions that we talk about with theories of emotion come to play, right? So, how
Yeah.
much is biological, how much is social, and how do the two intermix? I would be remiss if I, first of all, didn't say that, I think that strides have certainly been made in science
Yeah.
with regard to the representation of women. Um, People of color, definitely a different story still, and there's work to be done there. I think there is not a lot of good evidence when it comes to the biological argument that men and women have different cognitive abilities. There's been some really good debunking of those particular arguments. With regard to spatial reasoning and mathematics and so on. Um, I think this,
And let me just add, in the case of cognitive ability, generally speaking, not those distinctions between, for example, mathematical ability versus verbal ability and so on, but just IQ in general. Even the IQ researchers themselves do not find any relevant sex differences. So, I mean, women are as intelligent as men. So.
yeah, the evidence is not forthcoming that there are biological sex differences in general intelligence,
Yeah.
cognitive capacity, and so on. So the flavor that that the sort of more nativist approach takes then is that, well, by virtue of sex roles, men and women have different interests. There is some evidence, for instance, that men are more competitive. Um, then again, there's also a lot of evidence that, men are socialized quite differently than our girls with things relative to self-esteem and self-promotion and, the things that contribute to, say, a successful scientific career where you're comfortable being in hot competition with others. And so I think the evidence as it stands is more consistent with gender socialization. And I will add that, structural factors certainly play a role as well. So with regard to things like gender socialization, are women socialized to be less interested in these sort of scientific roles? It seemed like up until recently, when people drew pictures of a scientist, right? I'm sure you're familiar with this, right? Girls and
Yeah.
boys draw men. Apparently,
It would usually be Einstein, of course.
yes, exactly. Right, they drew white men,
Yeah.
and I believe I saw something recently suggesting that effect has changed, right? So now people, little girls are drawing girl scientists, and that's great, right? So
Yeah.
the dial has moved there. Um, do men and women have different preferences? There's some evidence that on the whole, when you look at these, big societal studies of people's stated preferences, the answers seem to be yes. However, those data don't disentangle the effects of gender socialization. So what people think that society, is prescribing for them, what they feel value in, that could all be socialized. But also what those studies don't take into account is the structures that help people who engage in caregiving, people
Mhm.
who engage in female stereotypical roles, have those careers, plus, have a family and so on. And I think that's where things start to get particularly murky, is that many modern societies still don't have the structures in place that allow a two working partner home to have people with equivalent careers. And then the question is, who makes the decision to pursue a career that is potentially, more time-consuming, potentially more, involves more conflict, involves more uncertainty. It seems like disproportionately women are the ones who are choosing not to pursue those careers, even after obtaining their PhD. So, to my mind, that's where people are exiting the pipeline, the scientific pipeline. Women are performing just as well as men up until they get the PhD, and then when it comes time to having children or taking care of family members or being a member of a community, those responsibilities fall disproportionately to women.
Mm-hmm. And so the argument here would be then that that happens because when it comes to perhaps having more of a, uh, let's say, work-life balance and perhaps sharing more household chores with men or with their partners or someone who is socialized as a male, let's say in that particular case, women have more often have to make sacrifices and decide, okay, so I can't really do both things at the same time. So in this particular case, I will perhaps sacrifice my scientific career or any other kind of career for that matter to take care of children, for example. Right.
Yeah, and I don't even know if the word sacrifice is the correct word there. Some people, because of how social roles work,
Mm.
it may actually feel more rewarding,
Yeah, right.
socialized as a woman, to
Yeah.
lean into, a parenting role or a caregiver role. Um, or it may feel like, yeah, you are explicitly sacrificing because, you just can't have your cake and eat it too.
Yeah, and when it comes to analyzing the data, what you're arguing is that just from the data people usually present, we can't really definitely say if that's the result of biological differences or the result of socialization or some sort of gender roles that have been learned, right?
Yeah, I mean, it seems clear from a biological standpoint that it's not a cognitive capacity issue.
Yeah.
Um, you know, I think it's very hard to say from a biological standpoint, where preferences come from, but certainly preferences are also socialized. And you can see, examples of cultures where, um, the typical gender socialization that we see that aligns with sex differences. When you don't get that alignment, you can see variation in behavior. And so, the question becomes, how is it that socialization is interacting with structures? To my mind, that's where the interesting data needs to come into play. So, for instance, could you look at places where the structures are different? So, the careers of women scientists in Sweden, for instance, there is a much more egalitarian, parental leave and so on. And there is some evidence actually suggesting that, not with regard to scientists per se, but workers,
Yeah.
that that structure is actually helpful in the careers of women, and causes more equal careers of women and men. So an example there where presumably gender socialization as a Western industrialized culture is quite equivalent to the U.S. And yet you see more women in the workforce and so on with careers that are able to persist. And so, doing something like that with scientists would be interesting.
Great. So I'm getting mindful of your time, Dr. Lindquist. So let's wrap up the interview here. Just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Yes, absolutely. So you can find my work at the Carolina Affective Science Lab, carolinaeffectivesciencelab.com, or at my personal website, kristenalindquist.com. And of course, both of those can be found through the University of North Carolina Psychology and Neuroscience website.
Great. I'm leaving links to that in the description box of this interview. And thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It's been really fun to talk to you.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks so much for having me.
Hi guys, thank you for watching the interview until the end. Please do not forget to share the video, subscribe to the channel and also leave a like. And if you like what I'm doing, please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. You can find the links in the description box of the interview. This show is brought to you by Enlight's Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Per Larsen, Jerry Mueller, Hans Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Visser, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Force Connolly, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Simon Columbus, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel Andrea, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Alexander Denbauer, Fergal Cusson, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londoño Correa, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Elman, Simon Afzal, Adrian Yeagy, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Panos Cortez, Ursula Litske, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sunny Smith, John Wiseman, Morten Eichland, Dr. Bird, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Mau Maria, Paul Jorge Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Ruth Towell, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Amari Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Pedro Bonilla, Ziegler, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Herringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassis, Tom Roth, DRPMD, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Richard Bowen, Thomas Dobner, Luke Neeson, Chris Story, and Manuel Oliveira. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Dugny, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Vega Giddy, Thomas Turnbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Robert Lewis, and Al Nick Ortiz, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Codrian, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.